Good day everyone. Today we will discuss successive service of sentences and the threefold rule. Now, what is the rule when a convict is given multiple sentences? The general rule is that a convict shall serve them simultaneously if the nature of the penalties permits simultaneous service of sentence. Otherwise, the penalties shall be served successively in the order of their severity using the scale in Article 70. At this juncture, I would like you to turn your pages to Article 70 and there you will find a scale. And that is the scale that the courts are to use whenever a convict is given multiple sentences. Now, here are the examples of sentences which can be served simultaneously with imprisonment. They are imprisonment and fine, imprisonment and disqualification, imprisonment and suspension, imprisonment and public censure, imprisonment and civil interdiction, imprisonment and confiscation, and assuming the death penalty will be reimposed and a convict will be given multiple death sentences, they can also be served simultaneously because a convict cannot die multiple times. He can only die once. But where the convict is sentenced to 2 or more terms of imprisonment, then these 2 or more terms of imprisonment should be served successively. Okay? Now, you will notice in Article 70 in the scale that destierro as a penalty cannot be served simultaneously with imprisonment. Why? Because both of them are in the nature of deprivation of liberty. Only that in destierro, it merely involves partial deprivation of liberty in the sense that the convict who is imposed a penalty of destierro will be banished to a certain place, or he will be prohibited from entering a place designated in the judgment. Simultaneous service of sentences means that the penalties can be served at the same time. If you would recall in the previous slide, the penalty of imprisonment can be served at the same time as the penalty of fine. Meaning to say, while the convict is serving his sentence of imprisonment, he can also at the same time pay the fine as ordered by the court. On the other hand, successive service of sentences means that the penalties of imprisonment should be served one after the other in the order of their severity using the scale in Article 70. This means that the time of the lesser sentence will not commence to run until after the expiration of the more severe sentence, and so on and so forth. The phrase "in the order of their severity" means that the most severe penalty should be served first, as shown in Article 70. For example, if the convict is sentenced to multiple sentences of prison correccional, arresto menor, and reclusion temporal, the order of severity is as follows. First is reclusion temporal, which is the most severe of the penalties imposed, then prison correccional, and then the last to be served by the convict is or should be arresto menor. Of course, successive service of sentences applies only when the convict is, number 1, given multiple sentences, and number 2, he has not started to serve them out. If he has already started to serve sentence in one and later he is sentenced to another term of imprisonment, then the rule does not apply. Question: why can't a convict serve 2 or more terms of imprisonment simultaneously or at the same time? Answer: the convict has to serve each of the sentences of imprisonment, because if he were to be allowed to serve 2 sentences of imprisonment at the same time, let's say reclusion temporal and arresto mayor, then it would result in an anomalous situation where the lesser penalty of arresto mayor would be absorbed by the more severe penalty of reclusion temporal. That would defeat the purpose of the law in imposing a penalty for every crime committed. Take note that the same is true even if the 2 sentences have the same duration. Question: if the convict is given 3 multiple sentences comprising of reclusion perpetua, life imprisonment, and reclusion temporal, does it mean he has to serve all of them successively? Answer: yes, but there is a limitation on successive service of sentences. This is known as the threefold rule. Under the threefold rule, the maximum period or total number of years of imprisonment that can be served by the convict is equal to 3 times the most severe of the penalties or the total of the penalties imposed, whichever is lower. But in no case shall this maximum period of imprisonment exceed 40 years. How to apply the threefold rule? Here are the steps. Step number 1, get the most severe of the penalties imposed using the scale in Article 70. Number 2, multiply the most severe of the penalties imposed by 3. Number 3, for purposes of comparison with step number 2, add the duration of all the different sentences imposed. Number 4, you then compare the results of steps 2 and 3. And number 5, the one to be applied is the lesser period, which in no case shall exceed 40 years. For purposes of the application of the threefold rule, both reclusion perpetua and life imprisonment, which are classified as perpetual penalties or pena perpetua, they are to be computed at 30 years each. Now, since life imprisonment is a penalty provided for in special penal laws, it follows that sentences imposed under special laws can also avail of this rule. Example number 1. The court imposed upon X the following multiple sentences: reclusion perpetua, life imprisonment, and reclusion temporal. Both reclusion perpetua and life imprisonment, for purposes of the threefold rule, have a maximum term of imprisonment of 30 years, whereas reclusion temporal has a maximum term of imprisonment of 20 years. Now, applying the threefold rule, you get the most severe of the penalties, multiply it by 3. So 30 times 3 is equal to 90 years. Now, compare that to the adding up of the penalties of reclusion perpetua, life imprisonment, and reclusion temporal. So 30 plus 30 plus 20 is equal to 80 years. Even if the lower period is 80 years, under Article 70, the convict can only serve up to 40 years imprisonment. Example number 2. X was imposed the penalty of 6 years, 10 years, and 11 years for various crimes. So the most severe of the penalties here is 11 years. Multiply it by 3, you get 33 years. Now compare that to the adding up of the multiple sentences, 6 plus 10 plus 11, you have a result of 27 years. Now, the lower between the two obviously is 27 years. So much so that X under the threefold rule is to serve 27 years of imprisonment. To reiterate, don't confuse the scales of penalties under Articles 25, 70, and 71. Take note that Article 25 is the scale to be used when ascertaining what are the principal and accessory penalties. It has nothing to do with severity, nor which is the higher or lower penalty. Article 70, on the other hand, is the scale to be used when a convict is to undergo successive service of sentences according to their severity, meaning which of the sentences are to be served first. Here you will notice that arresto menor in Article 70 is considered more severe than destierro because the former involves complete deprivation of liberty, whereas the latter does not. Article 71 is the scale to be used when graduating penalties in relation to Article 61. That is, in determining the penalty next lower in degree to be imposed for frustrated or attempted stages of a felony or for accomplices and accessories. Here, the penalty next lower in degree than arresto mayor is destierro. So, please take note of the distinctions among the three scales of penalties in the revised penal code so that you can apply them and use them accordingly.